So the problem looks like it's well set in terms of having models to give us predictions and projections, and all we have to do is take those and make decisions and policies. But obviously we have to look at some of the human systems and how they respond to or don't respond to or misuse the information that may be coming out of models or even observations. So that is about beyond predictions and projections. I always like to show some examples like these, where this is showing Japan's uneven progress in emissions. So remember Kyoto Protocol associated with Japan, which eventually failed anyways. So this is looking at millions of kilotons of CO2. It was having its ups and downs, and it was on the rise from 2010 to 2011, when I think the Fukushima happened in 2011. You check it, please. There was an earthquake, and then there was a tsunami. The tsunami damaged the nuclear plant, and there was not good, right? A lot of people died. Nuclear reactors failed, radiation leak, which is also in the ocean, etc., which spooked Japan quite a bit, naturally. And then Japan said they're going to rebuild coal plants because of this. So the debate is whether they were already struggling with the energy portfolio anyways. So the other examples are from car industries. Volkswagen, which comes from Germany, which is very progressive on climate action, even though it still hasn't phased out coal, but it's ramped up its renewables, etc. Volkswagen was cheating in the software monitoring emissions, and now it turns out many people are doing the same on their own in trucks to avoid being caught on emissions. And Toyota, which is the leading car manufacturer, is paying a record fine. This is news from just January 14th, and today is from January 19th, right? So Toyota is paying record fine for a decade of Clean Air Act violations. So all of these firms have announced their plans for sustainability, reducing emissions, reducing carbon footprints, increasing fuel efficiency, and so on. But corporate profit motive, of course, always drives sneaky things. But then also, who are corporations? They are non-entities. They are owned by people who invest in them. So we are all in it together. So beyond predictions and projections, we have to worry about these sorts of things, which I will run through in terms of several issues. But also we have to also just worry about the nature of adaptation limits, and there are 4 propositions for this from this paper here. Talks about the ethics of the nature of adaptation limits. The first proposition is that any limits to adaptation depend on the ultimate goals of adaptation, which are themselves dependent on diverse values. It's not always to protect life and property. It could be about protecting historic monuments, certain biodiversity, certain culturally important location, and so on. Knowledge. The second proposition is that adaptation need to be let me start again. The second proposition is that adaptation need not be limited by uncertainties associated with foresight of future climate change. It could be something you decide you're going to do anyways, like protecting the Great Barrier Reef by, let's say, changing the travel rules, not just sunscreen, etc., but just say Great Barrier Reef is not going to be inundated by tourists, right? Risk. The third proposition is that social and individual factors limit adaptation action. So there is always multiple factors involved in whether or not one will adapt. It's not just the limitation, it's just how risk is evaluated going into the future, right? Because you are adapting to things that are already happening, but also planning for what is projected. Culture. The fourth proposition is that systematic under-evaluation of involuntary loss of places and culture disguises real experienced but subjective limits to adaptation. So how people value their cultural artifacts, places, and the loss of them really is a very subjective, and that can limit adaptation. Like saying move a particular temple, let's say from the waterfront to protect it from sinking. Will people do that? Probably not. It depends on many other factors. Other human factors, this is nice work from Gidon Eschel, my friend, and his colleagues, I think, Amy somebody, when he was at Chicago. It's very nice, looks complicated, but let me just explain it in simple ways. This is looking at percent of caloric input from animal sources like poultry, lacto-ovo fish, and so on, and then additional ton of CO2 equivalent emitted by what car you are driving. So you can compare Prius, which is a hybrid environmental friendly car, against Camry, which is more of a gas guzzler, SUV versus Camry, or SUV versus Prius. And the main message is that even if you are driving a Prius, you are not necessarily having a smaller carbon footprint than someone who is driving SUV, because it depends on how you get your calories. If you're eating a lot of red meat while driving around in a Prius, then you could be just as bad in terms of your total carbon footprint as the SUV driver, if the SUV driver has a much lower food carbon footprint, let's say by being a vegetarian. So one action bias has to be watched out for in that case. Okay. Let me come back to this historical emissions in the next podcast and combine it with population issues. But you understand what the point of this is, that there is always predictions and projections and physical impacts, socioeconomic impacts demanding adaptation. But where do the adaptation limits come from? Is it financial? Is it physical? Is it cultural? Is it something very subjective? Right? Some people might say, I want to live in the mountain no matter what happens. Some people might say, I'm going to be a fisherman even if the fish are disappearing, and so on. So it's not always easy to give them information and say, change yourself. That's not how life works, unfortunately. So there are many things beyond predictions and projections that will become part of the challenge of adaptation and mitigation. And then the question is how those subjective values and implementation of adaptation add up to biophysical and biogeochemical feedbacks to the ongoing climate change. If certain regions, certain cultures, certain groups refuse to adapt, and their refusal, for whatever reason, amounts to amplifying climate change, then what do you do? So, very complicated issues.